So, as I said, I'm Catherine Jack. Everybody who is participating today has already participated in one of these sessions, so I don't need to go through a detailed guidance or opening this morning. We can get on with the agenda. We'll do the introductions first. I'll go to the council, please.
Yes, not first. Yeah, and Andy Miller, Sandwell Council, and also can I just advise everybody that on a Friday morning at 10:30 they test the fire alarms in this building. So you may not hear it. It depends on how well the room speakers sit up. But we'll all certainly know about it. So if we all look a bit horrified at 10:30, that's the reason why.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, Hugh Richards, planning barrister advising the council.
Samantha Holder, Senior Planning Policy Officer at Sandwell.
Patricia McCullough, Sandwell Council.
Okay, lovely. And is Mr. Carter here yet?
No.
Not yet.
Inspector.
Carl is.
Yeah, we do have an additional participant, Carl Mercer from our development management team. He's joining us virtually. He's on the screen, and he's here just in case there are any queries that relate specifically to the way Sandwell deals with DM issues.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mercer, would you just like to introduce yourself for the live stream, please?
Yes.
Hello, welcome.
Hello, hi. Yeah, I am Carl Mercer from Principal Planner in Development Planning. So yes, I'm just here for support if needed. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. Right, so before we get to the main agenda, I'd just like to extend my thanks to the council for the work that they did yesterday afternoon in updating SAED 81 and the housing requirement and supply figures following the Matter 13 session that we had yesterday. I've received that and I'll be reflecting on that. So my thanks to you for doing that so swiftly. Is there anything else in terms of updates that the council wants to make me aware of this morning before we get going?
Don't think there's anything else as we speak, no.
No. Okay, thank you.
For your comfort, we are up to date with our typed up list of action points for the week, so it won't take us very long to add today's and then get that over to you as well.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you very much. And obviously we are here today principally to talk about Matter 12, which is the development management policies, but you'll probably notice I popped on the agenda a next steps item, which I can, if the council would like me to, just talk through how I see what I'm going to do next, what I think you need to do next once we close this hearing session, in sort of fairly high level terms, but if that would be helpful, I'm happy to do that when we conclude.
That would be very helpful.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Right, let's get on with the main discussion about development management policies then. And when Mr. Carter joins us, hopefully he will put his camera on so that I spot that he's here, and I'll ask him to introduce himself at that point. So we'll start at the beginning. That's always the good place. Policy SDM1, design quality. Now for this one, the council has suggested a main mod in your hearing statement on page 9, and this relates to the part of the policy, which is part 3, which talks about major developments, and essentially responds to a rep about whether it was flexible enough, particularly in terms of the major developments, and whether the where appropriate thrust of the policy should come into part 3 as it does in other parts of the policy. And that is what your main modification looks to address. I've got no particular queries on that unless there's anything else I need to hear about that. That seems a sensible approach.
Yes, I think
with the rest of the policy.
Yes, I was absolutely. We were, looking for parity with the approaches set out elsewhere. The only other thing I was going to add is that paragraphs 15.15 and 15.16 of the justification text actually speak to this issue, but it wasn't sort of carried through to the policy. So it's really a matter of just clarifying and rounding up.
Yes, indeed. Okay, thank you for that.
15.15 and 15.16.
Okay, and it's linked to this, but my next question was going to be about whether there's any particular need for the policy to explicitly recognise that various requirements will only be deliverable where they are viable. The whole policy will now include a where appropriate hook, if you like. Is there anything else that you would say about that in terms of flexibility?
I don't think so. I think we have aimed for flexibility. We have recognised the various issues around viability throughout the plan, and certainly with the modification that we've suggested, I think that would provide the flexibility to be able to take viability into account where it was demonstrated by a developer and obviously demonstrated robustly that there was an issue around viability. Then we could, we're happy that the policy would accommodate that.
Okay. And the next point is about design coding and whether should this policy make any reference to site-specific design codes. Are site-specific design codes something that's an option for a developer? And policy SDS 5 at point 5 appears to encourage design coding at the high level. So the question is whether SDM 1 should reflect that too. It talks about the forthcoming Sandwell design code, such as when that is ready, and it talks about the National Design Guide. So it's really about whether can a developer go down the site-specific, produce their own design code route, and if they want to, how would they go about that? The policy seems to be silent on that.
Yes, I mean, that's quite right. I mean, as you say, we do talk about it. Well, we have talked about it in terms of the strategic design policy. There would be no reason why it couldn't go in here. I think it was probably just an omission. So we certainly, if a developer comes up with a design code or master plan that is very specific to a site, there is no reason why we wouldn't accept that, provided it met the requirements of the plan and it reflected the sort of general design principles that we're looking for. There would be no reason why we couldn't accept that.
There would be a hierarchy at such time as you have a design code borough-wide, wouldn't there?
Yes.
Then anything beneath that would need to be presumably consistent with your higher level design code, which isn't there yet. You mentioned also master plans, and I don't think there's a mention of master plans in here, but obviously design codes are specifically design quality related, and this is a design quality policy. Mr. Richards.
Yes, I've seen such policies, but they quite often add the caveat that the developer's design code must be approved by the local authority.
Yeah.
In other words, the developers can't mark their own homework.
Yes.
Yes.
We do also point 2C. We do reference master plans. Under it's the use of the building.
You do.
So we do reference master plans in there in compliance with the design code, etc. So
so it's possibly just if that's something you're encouraging, which SDS 5 seems to suggest you do encourage, then I thought perhaps it ought to follow through into this policy.
Yeah.
We could probably get a site-specific design code reference into 2C, couldn't we?
Yes. Seems the logical place to put it.
Yeah. I don't know if you wanted any sort of update on the design code process, but
If
obviously,
you have one, yes.
yeah, colleagues in urban design and other colleagues in the council are currently working with consultants on producing the Sandwell design code. We do have a timeline that we can provide for you if it would be useful, but the sort of the headline is really that adoption is proposed in early 2027, which may or may not have relevance to this plan, but will certainly have relevance to the subsequent plan. I think the consultants are currently working on the more strategic end of our design code, and there's going to be a draft design guide, as I understand it, proposed in December. So, you know, there will be more information coming out in December. The consultants, again, I would stress, are very aware of the SLP. They've had access to the draft plan. And as I understand it, they've used the submission SLP to inform, you know, their evidence as well.
Okay, and it's still the case, I imagine, that you told me previously it's not going to cover the entire borough. The aim was looking more at your regeneration areas as the focus of the main design code.
It's covering the regen areas specifically, but there's also general design guidance that will cover the whole of the borough. So it's like a two-part approach.
And what's the current thinking about the form that will take? Are you looking for that to be an SPD, or, you know, if supplementary plans come into being in the meantime? Is that what you're thinking?
As I understand it, having spoken to, as I say, colleagues yesterday, they're looking at supplementary plans. They were asking things about appointing inspectors, for example. So I think they've got it in mind.
Okay, Mr. Miller, did you want to add something?
Yeah, it was just to say that the commission was written in such a way that enabled them to, if you like, switch horses midstream, depending on whether we get any guidance out of government or not on supplementary plans. But certainly everything's been done on the assumption that it will be examined.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. The council statement suggests the option of potentially cross-referencing this design quality policy with various other ones in the plan to show the linkages with framework policies, climate change policies, historic and natural environment, etc. I've got no problem with that as a principle. I wondered whether, though, rather than doing that in the text of the policy, because there's potentially a lot and it could get a bit cluttered, and then there could be the argument of, well, oh, you didn't say this policy was relevant, whether you do a more general roundup in the supporting text of those linkages. What would the council think about that?
Yes, I think that's sensible.
Would that be
Just
a main?
because there's so many linkages, aren't there, with design? It sort of links everywhere, but you're going to want to tease out key ones, probably.
I feel a table coming on.
Yeah, well, however you like to do it. That's, yeah.
Would that be a main mod or an additional mod?
I think we might have that as put it on a main mods list for now, unless I have a change of heart. And of course, you could wrap up in that. I know the Canal and River Trust, they requested a link with SNE 6, didn't they? That could form part of that to address their concern.
We have actually put a link in part 1H. We've got one single solitary link to policy SNE 6.
Oh, that's, yes. In which case,
we could take it out.
I think that would be the sensible thing to do. Yeah. It's got to be all or nothing.
Yes.
Take that one out and specifically explain that with the other cross references in an extra paragraph or two. Or a table might be the most straightforward way to do it. Okay. No sign of Mr. Carter yet, but I think the police were essentially supportive of that policy and its references to park mark and secured by design.
Yes, they were.
So we will, unless anybody wants to say anything else about SDM1, I'm going to move on to SDM2. Development and design standards. I want to look at the nationally described space standards, and I understand the reasons that the council has set out as to why you're seeking to adopt that approach, and that you included that when you did your whole plan viability work was on the basis that the NDSS was met as the minimum standard. When we look at SDM 2 Part 1, which covers this, it currently requires the NDSS in all circumstances and appears to set out a sole exception being when there would be harm to the significance of a heritage asset. And I wondered initially for your thoughts about whether that is flexible enough to take account of other particular circumstances that might arise where NDSS might not be appropriate. Possible examples might be conversions, schemes that are intentionally designed as something else, like a micro home or some sort of innovative solution, for example, which potentially could offer good quality functional living environments, but would appear to be ruled out for not meeting the NDSS for one, unless they relate to a heritage asset, which obviously an innovative new design probably won't be a heritage asset. So I wondered firstly whether that is too rigid a stance, and secondly, when you look at SDM 2.2, it starts by saying where NDSS are not used, development should reflect the National Design Guide, etc., etc. So I'm not entirely convinced that that follows on quite right from what one currently says. So, I mean, over to you, really. Is it clear enough where they will and they won't be used, or is this going to potentially cause Mr. Mercer a headache in the future? And also your footnote 266, which is in, 265, talks about prior approval approach for new dwellings, basically, and then also says NDSS will apply in all such cases. So basically, I think that's meant to mean all new dwellings, NDSS will apply. Again, isn't quite clear what that's saying. Sorry, there's quite a lot in there, and I wanted to wrap up.
Well, if I could start with the last element first, I suspect that footnote is meant to refer to situations where, for example, office buildings are being converted to flats. And, you know, we've all heard the horror stories about the size of some of these conversions. So I suspect the implication there is very much that if somebody is proposing the conversion of a building that, you know, like an office building or what have you, it has to meet the relevant size guidelines to make sure that people don't suffer in their living accommodation. Turning to the exemptions, I think, I mean, your point about the micro homes is a good one. It would be very difficult to encourage that sort of innovation under the policy as it is, and that wasn't the intention.
I suspect it probably wasn't.
No, it was. I think we were mostly concerned that where buildings are converted or created across the board, it's easy. I suppose it's easier with a new build to make sure that you build in certain standards. But when you're talking about conversions, then the reason for the heritage exemption is that you work with what you've got, and that can be tricky. But in terms of other sorts of conversions or other sorts of development, yes, I think we probably need to look at flexibility in terms of the wording here.
I mean, we could simply add to the end of part 1, any other departure from NDSS will require convincing justification.
Yeah.
So we're not ruling out other departures. We're just saying it will require convincing justification.
And
Yes.
leading on from that, I think we do have to be careful just in terms of the fact that you'll have seen from the representations that a lot of house builders and the HBF and interested parties are saying this is not workable. So, we need to be very clear that I think in the main this is going to apply to new builds. And there isn't much difference between what we're seeing now coming in and what the NDSS is proposing. We just need to be very clear about when this applies and that we are expecting it in the main for the new builds.
Yeah, and some of that explanation could go in your supporting text. You don't want to, unduly fill part 1 with all of that. But if we can draft the wording that part 1 is a little bit more accommodating for where there are those exceptional types of schemes that might be different. And then the supporting text could explain what you've just said, that principally it's new builds, but obviously you might be aiming for conversions to achieve this where it's practicable. There might be other examples where there's a conversion where it can't quite do it for some reason, but in other it's that little bit of flexibility, isn't it, for when something that's a perfectly good scheme might come forward that because of the nature of the existing building doesn't quite tick the box of the NDSS but would otherwise be acceptable, sort of thing.
Absolutely. Just leading on from our previous discussion about the design code, I did, again, as I say, speak to colleagues yesterday, and it was confirmed to me that the new design code, the Sandwell design code, will be based on the NDSS in terms of the sort of the size of dwellings and size of rooms, etc., that is being sought. So again, there is that parity between what the local plan is suggesting and what the design code will be looking for anyway.
Yeah, okay, that's good. So an MM there in terms of the wording of that and some supporting text to go with it. And I suspect once you've done that, part 2 will follow on better as it is, if you see what I mean. Okay. So let's look at the water efficiency standards next.
We're suggesting an amendment in our statement.
Yes, which I want to talk through with you. So you've gone in the policy as it stands in part 3. You've gone for the higher optional 110 litres standard. And now you're looking to change the policy to reduce that down to 100 litres as a blanket requirement, essentially, across the board.
Yeah.
Now, I understand why you're suggesting that from what has been put before me. My query, I suppose, really is at this stage of the game, and based on the evidence relating to the 100 litres rather than the 110, seems to be more about incentivising that lower consumption target at this point, So my question to you is at this stage of the plan's evolution, is a direct switch from 110 to 100 litres as a blanket requirement justified on that incentivising evidence? And I wondered, depending on your response to that, whether a policy requirement for 110 litres, but that clearly encourages doing better than that, without mandating 100, say, might be more reasonable, more proportionate to the evidence that you've got at the moment for the purposes of this plan.
Yeah.
And then what you do in your new plan might be something different, mightn't it? I'm not fixed on that view. It's just a discussion point. What do you think?
Well, my experience of working on the other side of the fence is that if you have a requirement for one thing and encourage another, 99% of developers will simply not bother to be encouraged and will just go for the 110 because they will think that that is commercially more enticing to a prospective purchaser. That's the sad reality.
Yeah,
I understand that, but tying it back to the evidence, which talks about a forthcoming need to get there for 2050, and I understand you're in a water stressed area and there isn't a debate about that. My query more closely ties to I'm not convinced that the evidence gives you quite the robust position, particularly to draw it in at this point in time. We did hear from your consultants the other day that I take your point, Mr. Richards, people will do what they're required to do and they won't necessarily be motivated to do any more than that. He did talk about some of the small and medium sized builders that are more motivated to do that sort of thing because it gives them a slightly different selling point, I think was the point that he was making. So perhaps it wouldn't be everybody that avoided it. But then what your evidence says is that there are incentives available from the water companies to make sure that it wouldn't necessarily be much harder for developers or much more expensive, whether they're a large developer or a small one. My understanding is to go further.
That was how I read it. Yeah, I was going to make that point, the fact that the incentives are coming from the water companies. The water cycle study that we did went into this in some detail. I think it's referenced in the policy. I think the statement says it's improvements could be delivered at minimal cost and with additional savings to householders. I think your point is a good one, Inspector, in as much as it may well be something that we take more focus on in the next version of the plan. I think it's if we can retain a reference in this policy to 100 litres. So as you say, it's flagging up that there is an option for developers, should they wish to go to the higher standard, the even higher standard, and there will be some benefits to them, or no disbenefits to them in doing so. And as you say, it may be something that certain developers find more appealing if they are going for the eco market, if you like. I mean, I think we would probably say we'll leave it. We can prepare some additional wording if you want us to, certainly.
The other thought I've had is that sometimes developers can't fully address other aspects of their scheme and are looking around for additional benefits to put in the planning balance in their favour. One thing that they often do on big schemes is to offer more affordable housing than the minimum required, for example. In this case, the council could say to them, well, you have got deficiencies in this area of your scheme, but if you were able to offer the 100 litres a day standard rather than the 110, we would give
or
you... Or
even better than that. There would be nothing to stop them, potentially.
we would give you extra credit to help make up for your sin of not, I don't know, planting a tree or something, you know.
And I take your general point, but yes, so that, I mean, in theory, you could encourage them to go as far as you want, couldn't you? But you it's whether mandating 100 is reasonable. You've got a yellow sticky. What does that say?
Yes. Waving a yellow sticky. Apparently DEFRA has signalled they're considering 105 litres.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
that's a
there
sort of
are
hard one.
definitely these things that are coming down the track. They're
Yeah.
not necessarily right here, right now in your current
Keep it up.
evidence,
Yes.
which is
But
why
I-
I'm reasonably which is why I'm reasonably comfortable with you going for a support, you know, supporting doing better at this stage, rather than mandating it. And then, you know, who knows, actually the national position might be tighter by the time you get to your next plan anyway. Which sort of brings me into the my next point, which is about you talk about the successor legislation at the end of part 3, which I think is intended as a future-proofing comment. Now, presumably what you mean by that is that if the successor legislation brings in a lower literage than 110, you would default to that,
Yeah.
not just that 110 will still apply even if it's sort of relaunched in a different bit of the legislation. At the moment, it's not quite clear, but I think what you mean is the policy would be 110 litres per day, or whatever comes.
Yeah.
That might be tighter than that in future legislation. So where are we at then? Are we sort of in an agreed position that the policy will mandate 110, encourage better, potentially mentioning 100. Supporting text then could set out the reasoning why you want people to go better, to encourage them, and the incentives that are currently available, which of course might not be available. I mean, hopefully they would be, but they might not be available throughout the life of the plan. But if you can signpost them to where they can get those incentives to the water companies. And then I would suggest just review that future-proofing bit of at the end of 3, just to make sure it really does what you want it to do.
Yeah, thank you.
And all of that as MMs.
Yes.
Okay. Anything else on SDM2? Let's go to tall buildings and gateway sites then, which is SDM3. And my first question with this is, does the plan make it clear what actually constitutes a tall building for the purposes of Sandwell and this policy? And does that need to be clarified for effectiveness? Because obviously what's tall is quite a subjective and context-based thing.
I'd like to say that's why it doesn't specify, because it is so specific to Sandwell.
I think you might need to say something about it, because is tall 4 stories? Is tall 15 stories? You know, in terms of when this policy applies as a tall building, at the moment, that is ripe for debate, isn't it? As to and whether that is something, I mean, I don't know whether your urban design colleagues are looking at that sort of thing with design coding as well. Paragraph 15.35 tells us what a gateway site is.
Yes.
But the supporting text does not help us with what a tall building might be. Thoughts?
Yes. I think it's fair to say that there aren't many places in Sandwell that could support a tall building. My understanding is you would be looking at taller buildings in places like West Bromwich in the centre. We have, I imagine, well, we've got heritage tall buildings. We've got historic buildings that are quite tall in certain places, but we've got tower blocks in various other places. But in terms of new build, I don't want to put Mr. Mercer on the spot, but I'm just wondering whether you can think of anywhere apart from West Bromwich where we might expect to see applications for taller buildings coming in. By taller, I mean I was thinking sort of 4.5, 5-storey or above.
Yeah, I think the only place I can think of is with the tallest building we've probably had to deal with in recent times was a car park and residential scheme near the hospital site, near Midland Metropolitan Hospital. So whether there's a potential for a tall building in that area, that's probably the only other place I can think that it would be set.
How tall was that, Carl? How many stories?
It may well have been, I think it was about 9 stories. Andy, can you remember from the top of your head something like that? 9 stories?
But it was 9 stories, yeah.
The other thing, we've slipped into talking about taller buildings and we haven't defined what they are.
No. Sorry, I'm just trying to get a feel for what in Sandwell constitutes noticeably tall buildings.
I think, Sam, I just wondered in general whether do we tie it into what comes in for you have fire risk for residential buildings. I think it's something like 7 stories or 18 meters high. Do we have to give those? I imagine, are we better off giving those sort of parameters as part of the wording or not?
I think the inspector's suggestion that we go away and think about it and talk about it with urban design colleagues, so that in terms of design, planners and designers mean the same thing when they talk about tall buildings. That will definitely be an advantage.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There is an issue, isn't there? Because of in separate contexts, there are definitions for tall buildings which have arisen through, as you say, building safety and cladding issues and that sort of thing. But that might not be what you mean in a design-related development management policy about what becomes tall for Sandwell, which, as you said, while you've got some tall buildings, notably tall, much taller than the surrounding context buildings of multiple stories, your overriding context isn't like certain parts of Birmingham or London or where there are much taller buildings. But I think we need to know.
We'll take that away.
Right? Can you hear me?
Yes, we'll take that away and come back with a proposal for a main mod in due course.
And whether that talks about tall and taller buildings, because that seemed to slip in, that is sometimes what policies do. But it's going to depend on your context. But for effectiveness, it's difficult.
Yeah. Policy 4 in this policy already talks about taller buildings. Yes.
So perhaps the title is tall, taller, and gateway sites. I don't know, but I mean, it needs a bit of work and definition, and some of that might be in the supporting text. But at the moment, as I say, it's difficult to know when you need to apply that policy, isn't it?
Yeah.
At least some guidance. Design coding potentially might be relevant to this as well, but
I would be surprised if they weren't addressing this in the design code, but as you say, we can double check with colleagues and just get back to you on.
And it might be something if somebody was proposing a truly tall building, well, what perhaps everybody might reasonably think of as a tall building, that might be a situation where you would be expecting design codes, going back to what we were talking about with SDM1, isn't it? So whether you want to talk about that linkage in your supporting text as well. Mr. Miller.
Yeah, just for some context on this, I think that the background as to why this policy was brought forward in the first place was that West Bromwich Town Centre sits on a ridge line, and there's a series of taller buildings, if we want to use that particular phrase, along that ridge line. And we had a proposal for I think it was 14 stories building, which would have been by some distance the tallest building around. In the end, it never proceeded. So it's just a historical curiosity now. But the problem was we had no policy against which to judge it. So that's the background behind it. That was why this was put in at the time. And because the West Bromwich Town Centre is on a ridge line, so it's significantly higher than the surrounding area to start with, it was a particular issue in dealing with that planning application, and it kind of highlighted a gap in our existing BOS.
Okay.
I think as well, I mean, just circling back to where we started this discussion, it is going to be very much context dependent, because what is considered a tall or taller building in somewhere like West Bromwich is not going to be the same as what is considered a tall or taller building in Oldbury, say. And I think the policy needs to retain a degree of flexibility such that we can say, well, you know, in places like West Bromwich, in town centres, a tall building may be X. However, in a smaller or, you know, generally lower context, a tall building might be Y, and not have, you know, that degree of prescription which says you only need to employ this policy if your building is above 7 stories. If you're in somewhere like Oldbury or Smethwick or Cape Hill, it might be different. It might be different. And I think you need to retain that sensitivity.
Yeah, local context is key. Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with you there.
Okay.
Okay, I will leave that with you then.
We have proposed a modification in our hearing statement to criterion 1.
Which is a Historic England request, I believe. Yeah.
Well, we've got quite a few there that all relate to Historic England's comment, I think.
Okay, so the first one is criterion 1.
Yeah. Just
cross-link back to the historic environment policies. It may be, I suspect, I mean, I haven't got a problem with that in theory, but that you might want to consider that in the round when you're looking at defining what's a tall building or guiding what might be a tall building. But yes, in theory, I see no reason with flagging the historic environment policies. 5G.
I think this was
again. This is a context type situation, isn't it?
Yeah. Again, I think this was Historic England being concerned about where you've got, say, a church spire or something on the skyline that you don't obscure it.
I wonder if that's expanding upon the main policy requirement, isn't it? I wonder if that's really more of a supporting text rather than the policy point.
Yeah.
And then 6
Text A is gateway sites, I think.
Key
we-
extant landmark buildings. That's fine. Views of them and their settings will be protected as necessary.
Hmm.
I mean, unless anyone wants to comment on it, I don't see a particular problem with that. It says as necessary, might always be necessary. Fine. Okay. Anything else on all buildings and gateway sites? No. Okay.
No, I don't think so. Yeah.
No.
Okay. Next up, it's advertisements then, SDM4. Now, this one, there's another suggested about flagging up the historic environment development plan policies.
Yeah.
My reservation about this one is obviously the advertisement regulations do confine relevant considerations to amenity and public safety, and determining an application for advertisement consent, the provisions of the development plan are only really a material consideration. Under the guise of amenity, SDM 42B already talks about amenity and the character of the location. My inclination would be not to, in that context, flag up other development plan policies which
Okay.
Aren't wholly amenity related.
Yeah.
yes, not
Yes.
necessarily, and the development plan as a whole will be a material consideration rather than a section 38(6) doesn't
That's,
apply. So
again, this was in response to Historic England, who
yeah,
are concerned to ensure that the historic environment is considered all the way through, which is fine. But I think we'll take that
I don't
point.
see any problem with the supporting text signposting.
No.
And it does already, I think at 15.4 it talks about list of buildings and actually it talks about conservation areas. But it doesn't talk about listed buildings by the looks of things. Perhaps it's just a matter of adding a sentence to 15.40.
Yeah.
Okay. I've got nothing else on the advert policy. Which brings us to shop fronts and roller shutters, SDM 5. The council's suggested some expanded wording related to shop fronts in list of buildings for this one. Okay, is there also a need for a similar clarification relating to listed buildings or historic buildings in relation to the roller shutter element of the policy? But specifically shop fronts.
So it could be the alteration of shop fronts or the installation of roller shutters. Something along those lines.
Yeah, potentially. I wondered as well whether it needs to be broadened out. It's not necessarily just listed buildings. There could be historic shop fronts that might be a non-designated heritage asset,
Yeah.
potentially.
Yeah, I think I do have a note to that effect. Most shop fronts are neither listed nor in conservation areas, so policies must address the wider requirements.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah, so we'll broaden the scope
I think so.
to include all heritage.
Heritage assets.
We'll also make it clear that the same applies to not just to shop fronts, but to roller shutters.
And it might be helpful to expand the supporting text in that regard, particularly with listed buildings, so that people understand that both roller shutters and shop fronts and listed building consent might be needed, whether a roller shutter is internal or external, for example, just to signpost people. But historic shop fronts, as you say, not necessarily a designated heritage asset. I wonder whether you therefore need a point that applies to both, as you're sort of going down that road about designated heritage assets, that perhaps points people to the fact that they're going to need an understanding of the significance of the building. And then particularly if they want to take out a historic shop front, for example, and then maybe supporting text points to the other historic environment policies again, something like that.
Do you think it might be an idea to have two parts to this policy as now, roller shutters and shop front design, and then have a separate part dealing with heritage assets?
I think that might be sound, yes.
Rather than try and fit heritage matters into both of those policies, have a separate with heritage.
Yes.
Separate supporting text to go with it.
Yeah.
I suspect that would end up much cleaner in terms of its effectiveness and people's understanding of what they need to do. Then you could have a particular heritage assets paragraph or two in the justification to make that clear.
Yes, so we won't make the suggested change to 2A. What we'll do is make a change to add a new 5.3.
Yes, I think that makes sense. Okay. And I'll leave that with you to think about the wording. I've got nothing else on shop fronts and roller shutters.
Takeaways.
So we're at hot food takeaways now, which is, I think, what Mr. Carter wanted to talk about. Are you here, Mr. Carter, now?
I think he might be.
Good morning, Mr. Carter.
There he is.
Yeah. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can. Thank you. Would you just like to say who you are for the sake of the live stream, and then we're going to talk about the hot food takeaway policies.
Yeah, I'm David Carter from Tyler Parks, here representing the Police Crime Commissioner for West Midlands. Can I apologise for being late? And I'm on my phone because for some reason I couldn't actually access the link on my computer. No idea why.
Oh, well, that's technology for you, isn't it? Yeah.
Basically, as I see it, the council and ourselves are at one, according to their statement, as we suggested that the two policies, SDM 6 and 7, should be combined. Really, not because there's anything wrong with either policy, but it seemed to us that as two separate policies, it would be possible for a development to comply with one, but not the other. and that would create potential tension. So by combining the policy, that would eradicate that risk, basically. That's all I had.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, that appears to make sense. And it seems to me that the council, that is now the council's thinking. Council, you've presumably seen the way that Mr. Carter set out a proposed combining of the two policies in his statement. Do you agree that you're sort of thinking along similar lines?
Yes, I think two short and well-crafted policies being amalgamated into one longer policy.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Can you believe it? Yeah.
Absolutely fine.
Presumably it'll have a subheading saying management of hot food takeaways or something when you roll them together. But yeah, so it sounds like everybody's on the same page in terms of combining those two together as a main modification.
Yes, we haven't set out in our hearing statement precisely how we would do that, but as you say, Mr. Carter has helpfully done that, and we shall take that as our first port of call. I don't say we will faithfully reproduce it, but that will be our first port of call.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'll leave that drafting with you. So that is both SDM 6 and 7 dealt with. And then we're into SDM 8, gambling activities and alternative financial services, which actually I've got no further questions about, unless there's anything that the council was going to say on that today.
I don't think so.
No.
We haven't got any suggested changes to that.
No. SDM 9 then, community facilities. First of all, looking at part 3, which talks about the need for the provision of car parking. And I'm trying to understand how that relates to your maximum parking standards for non-residential uses, which are set out in Appendix K. Is 3 intended to be instead of that maximum standard for the purposes of community facilities? And is it clear what that relationship is? Because this seems to be concerned about making sure there is plenty of parking, if you like, whereas the maximum standards are maximum standards and are seeking to do the opposite, in effect, and reduce the numbers of cars visiting these types of facilities. So yeah, Ms. Holder.
We're just having a fire alarm. That's it.
Did you hear any of what I said?
No, hear it.
No.
We lost you after standards in Appendix K maximum, which one is intended to take precedence?
Yes, and then it all went to white noise.
Okay. Yeah, so my thinking is 3 appears to be trying to ensure that there's plenty of parking for these sorts of facilities, whereas your maximum standards for non-residential are obviously just that, and they're seeking to reduce parking and encourage people not to drive to non-residential sites. So what's the relationship and how would it work, and is it clear?
I'm going to call on the good officers and Mr. Miller at some point, but what I would just say as background to this is a policy that came from our previous local plan, the SAD policy, SAD DM6, I believe. I think the way the policy is worded, or certainly the way it's intended to be used, is that this sort of activity is best located in town centres where there will be adequate, or there should be adequate public transport provision available. in terms of maximum parking standards, in terms of what we've inherited from the previous policy, I am no expert. So as I say, I'm sort of looking at Mr. Miller. I think it's that reference, I suspect, is to where such activities are going to be proposed in areas such as employment areas, which is what we're trying to manage through this policy, where you would expect that there will be parking available. And also, depending on the nature of the activity, it could attract a lot of people at certain times of the week or certain times of the day. But I'm going to hand over to Mr. Miller, because I have no idea about car parking.
No, I think
Mr. Miller.
Mrs. Holder's actually sort of picked up the salient point. We, in the borough, we already have a number of facilities like this that have been conversions from particularly employment buildings. And what that has resulted in is pressure on on-street car parking in those areas, because in spite of protestations to the contrary, the vast majority of users arrive by car. And so highways colleagues were looking for something in the plan to give them a hook on which to require car parking in those circumstances to meet demand rather than to manage demand. But I accept that there is, to a degree, a contradiction here. And I think it's one I would like to take away under the circumstances. I know the reason it's there, and I fully understand, and it's an issue that our planning committee members wrestle with on a regular basis. I'm sure Carl will have a wry smile when we remember one or two of these as the planning committee. And this was an attempt to deal with that. This was back in the days of the previous plan, not this one, and we've carried it forward into this plan. But I agree, there's certainly a potential contradiction in terms there, and I think we either need to revisit it or we need to explain that contradiction somewhere.
I mean, it seems to me that in order to be effective and therefore sound, at the moment, this policy needs to say whether the Appendix K maximum standards apply in this instance. Either the policy will say they do apply, and all of this is in the context of the maximum standards, or it will say the maximum standards do not apply, thus giving scope for exceeding the maximum standards in this instance.
Yeah, I mean, I think
we need to say which one it is. Yeah. Otherwise, the policy is effective.
Yeah, it's not effective as it stands.
Yeah, I think the intention was to avoid a circumstance where such a facility provided no car parking.
Yeah. So, yeah, Inspector, if I could ask you just to help guide us, would you have a concern either way if we said Appendix K maxima are applying or are not applying? Is it simply a matter for us, or would you have concerns one way or the other?
The only concern I would raise off the top of my head, if you say they're not applying specifically for these schemes, it needs to be clear why these schemes and not other things to which the non-residential parking standards currently apply that might fall within similar or same use class but aren't necessarily a community facility. It sounds like you've had particular sort of bad experiences, shall we say, with certain cases, which yes, obviously led to this historically. My concern, as you know, I think we're all clear now, is this apparent contradiction between your parking standards and what 3 is attempting to do. Clarity is essential, but obviously also there's a slight confusion because there are several different types of uses within the umbrella of community facilities, which fall in slightly different parking ratios in your non-residential parking standards. Yeah. So it's a little bit of unpicking to do there, I think, potentially. In the first instance, I'm happy to leave that with the council to put their heads together and work out what a solution might be, but obviously do that conscious of the fact that if you're going to say the borough-wide standards don't apply to this particular policy or a part of it, I'll need to be pointed to some evidence that justifies that approach.
Thank you. I've got enough there to take that away and discuss it with my colleagues in highways.
Yeah,
And actually
okay.
development management as well. I think it will need a little bit of input from both of them.
Yeah, heads together, perhaps, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. I'll leave that with you then. And then I just want to have a quick look at 4 and exactly what that is trying to do. It says consideration may also be given to the granting of planning permission for a limited period where concerns relating to an application are insufficient to warrant refusal. Now, what's that trying to do? Is it trying to suggest a trial run period? If it is, I mean, possibly that could be significant cost and uncertainty to an applicant. Is it justified? Is it reasonable? And how will you operate that in practice? And is it meant to be an exceptional situation? A little bit of background and thought on what that's trying to do, please.
Yeah, I can briefly kick off. I might ask colleagues to illuminate it a little bit further. As I say, my understanding is much of this policy stems from the SAD, the previous local plan. I would imagine that this would relate in part possibly to uses such as banqueting suites or, you know, the sorts of activities that perhaps initially weren't that familiar in the borough or weren't that common. So it was a matter of issuing maybe a time limited permission, see how they operate, and then, you know, sort of move forward on that basis. Again, I don't know if Carl or any of the people that have been involved in the decision making or commenting might be able to throw a little bit more light on it. But that's, you know, that's my understanding.
Yes, Sam, tends to be, you know, a lot of the time committee members are uncomfortable about granting consent without, you know, and I can see that there's an issue there for applicants having certainty over their consent, but it's primarily down to parking, because when you see conditions that limit the time limits for the development to run, it's parking or it's noise and disturbance issues. Whether that needs to be pointed out in a plan is up to debate, because it, you know, obviously it depends on whether it's a reasonable and a reasonable condition. You'd expect, I mean, my opinion is always, you know, you'd expect it to be set out in a plan application. I know there may be doubts over those matters moving forward, especially if we you know, officers haven't dealt with that type of application before, or committee members haven't seen that type of application before. But you know, you would expect that sort of information to be more conclusive with a planning application rather than being subject to a temporary consent, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, part 2 of the policy deals with noise concerns. Part 3, as it stands, deals with car parking concerns. So I wonder, you know, what 4's trying to do, whether it's justified and whether it actually serves a necessary purpose in the policy.
I think that I mean I can think of a couple of instances where this has happened, and in both instances it was related to car parking, where the applicant was in their transport statement saying that the majority of users walked. Neither officers or members were particularly convinced by that argument. temporary consent was issued, and it became immediately obvious that nobody walked. So when it came in for a permanent consent, it was judged on the basis of evidence that we gathered during the period of time when he had a temporary consent in place. And I think that's the background to where this policy came from.
That must have been a change of use application rather than a new build. Though,
it was indeed a change.
It would be wholly unreasonable to say you can build your new building, but
only for 3 years.
But only for 3 years.
No,
Yes.
The two instances I can think of were both a change of use from a industrial building to a quasi-religious community facility on both occasions.
Perhaps this should, if it's going to stay, it needs to perhaps be more specific for a change of use type scenario, because that seems to be where the problem.
Yeah, I think and also I think that clause 4 is kind of related to clause 3 as well.
Yeah, which you're going to look into. So you
right.
might need to look into that in the round. Also, if that's going to stay, I think you need to explain it in the supporting text as to what it means to people and the specific circumstances where you might need to go down that route. But I mean, a lot of this is now up in the air for a bit of a rethink, isn't it? So
But I think you're quite correct. The circumstances in which I would envisage this applying primarily, I can't think of a circumstance where it would apply to a new building. It's going to be change of use. So if nothing else, it requires clarification that it refers to change of use application.
Yeah. I mean, depending on what happens with what the policy says about parking, it might be that just deal with any possibility that they're going to have to tell you exactly how their parking is going to work, and if there are concerns, there might be a temporary permission granted in the supporting text, and there might not be a need for a policy point about that. But I think you need to get to the bottom of where you are with parking before you can move on and get to the bottom of what point 4 needs to actually do now.
Yeah, it's basically parking, isn't it?
Parking is obviously the problem. 15.83 talks about assuming sufficient parking is made available, and again that sort of links back to that contradiction with the parking standards. There's clearly a bit of a tension there generally in terms of that policy. Now I want to look at part 6 and whether it's appropriate that the requirement is for if a facility is to be lost, simply not economically viable. That's the criteria at the moment. No longer economically viable. My thinking was, well, what about facilities perhaps run by charities or volunteers, etc., that aren't economically viable on their own, or perhaps they're part of a wider facility or wider enterprise. So the community element might not be economic. And whether this might lead to a sort of unintended, too easy loss of community facilities, if you like, that might still have a role to play, perhaps either as another community facility with another user or something like that.
Yeah.
The framework talks about community facilities. Among other things, it wants you to guard against the unnecessary loss of them.
Yeah.
Which was leading, that's paragraph 97. So whether that approach in 6 is consistent with what the framework is looking for you to do. And it might be that that's not an intentional sort of backdoor to losing these facilities, but I wonder whether the wording as it is could open that door. Mr. Richards.
You've alerted us to many types of viability. One is economic, The other is, does something become not viable to continue because they can't get the volunteers who are used to running it? So maybe we delete the word economically.
I think the thinking behind this particular section, it was while we were sort of drafting the policies, obviously we were having discussions, and the issue came up in particular about the loss of public houses in and around Sandwell. I mean, public houses are, they are a sort of historic feature of the Black Country in general. And with the sort of well-publicised issues around the viability of this sort of use, it was a concern that was identified to us, that we were losing a lot of these venues. So I think that the framing of the policy is very much referring to economic viability, because that was where this aspect of the policy came from. It came from this concern about, pubs going to the wall. You're right. I mean, it also talks about social and community clubs or similar uses, and all similar uses could apply to a whole number of things. So it probably is a good idea to free up the policy wording slightly, and as Mr. Richard said, maybe delete reference to economic viability and put viability as its own thing, as its own general requirement.
The end of the policy says this requirement applies equally to community venues, currently open or not, but it's talking about community venues more widely. Or do you need a separate criterion relating to pubs? And then a more general one about not looking to easily lose other community facilities as well. I mean, that might not be the answer, but that's just off the cuff.
The other thing I was thinking about was the discussion again that we had about SDS 6 and how you manage the loss of community and cultural facilities. And there we were talking about marketing exercises and making sure that there was this sort of more rigid process to go through, whether a reference to that policy would work here, or whether we'd want to go into a little bit more detail about it here. I don't know whether that would be appropriate. But certainly I think the idea of maybe hiving off the more commercial venues from the community venues might be something we could look at.
Yeah, I think that the danger of using the term economically viable in here is that one of the problems that the public house situation had was we were getting applications to remove a public house, not because it was no longer economically viable, but simply because the landowner could make more money from another use. So it was a well-used community public house, and its loss would be a significant loss to the local community. But it wasn't being lost because it was no longer viable as a going concern as a business, but simply because there was a better rate of return from another use.
Yeah,
and that was part.
Would that be covered by SDS 6 as a cultural facility?
And it wouldn't as currently worded, but I think it was partly the motivation for the policy in the first place. So,
I mean, there is normally these policies, this type of policy has a sort of marketing clause in it, doesn't it?
And of course, there's almost inevitably going to be a link between this policy and applications for asset to community value, and which is separate, but nonetheless, there's a link between the two.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think it needs strengthening on the basis of NPPF 97 and the need to safeguard against unnecessary loss, whether that is through some form of marketing exercise or some other approach. I'm happy to leave with you to think about and suggest a solution if you're all happy with that. It might just be in rewording 6 somehow, but it needs a little bit more work on that safeguarding front, particularly hearing your concerns about pubs being lost too readily across your borough, for example, as an example.
Mhm.
Okay, that's all I was going to raise on SDM 9. And then that brings us to the last DM policy, SDM 10. And I've not got much on this, but looking at part 2, and this is a little point, but it doesn't feel like it reads quite right, and it might simply be a matter of commas not being in the right place, or not enough of them, or too many, or something. But particularly where that junction with the comma is, the first comma.
The way I read it at the moment is that the form of telecommunications equipment will be expected to be a micro cell installation where there's an agreement to use existing street furniture. I.e., there's if there are agreements, that's what you should do. You shouldn't put anything freestanding in.
Maybe it just needs the word "and should not clutter the street scene," or something like that afterwards, just to flow it on. And then 3 talks about potential use of Article 4 directions to remove PD rights for telecoms development, whether you've considered there's a risk to amenity. And I'm just thinking, what's your justification for doing that? It's obviously removing PD rights should be an exceptional thing to do.
I was wondering why the policy is there in the first place, because it's not a development management policy. It's not a DM policy, is it?
No. Remove. Do you mean the whole policy? Or
The
just
whole
part
of
3?
10.3.
Yeah, whole of 10.3. I would agree with you on that.
Yeah.
Delete 10.3.
Referencing
I think again, this was a hangover from the previous local plan, and I haven't done the development management or development control as it was called when I did it for many years. And I think permitted development rights around telecommunications equipment has changed quite a lot. You've got the prior notifications and everything else, and I wouldn't claim to understand it. So I'm just wondering whether that is a carryover from.
Quite possibly. I mean, there was a period of time where this was all incredibly difficult and incredibly controversial, wasn't there?
Yes. And it created an awful lot of work.
Yes. Absolutely. Okay, that was all I wanted to raise on SDM 10. So does anybody have anything else they want to say today about the development management policies? Mr. Carter, are you happy that you've said everything or heard everything that you came along to see and hear today?
Yes, I'm happy. Thank you very much.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much for taking part. Now, you missed the beginning of the session, but I said to the council that once we've dealt with all the development management policies, I'd talk to them briefly about next steps and some points on what they need to do next in terms of drafting modifications. But I will draw the DM policies discussion to a close. I'm also going to suggest that because it's nearly 11 o'clock, we have a short break, and then I'll come back and talk to the council about that, so we can grab a cup of coffee or something. Shall we reconvene? What sort of, do you want a very short break, or would you like 20 minutes,
Have a
councillor?
quarter of an hour. Or an hour.
Yeah, okay, we'll come back at about 10 past then, 10 past 11, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Carter, you're welcome to stay and listen if you want to when I talk to the council, or you're equally welcome to leave if you've had enough.
I'll leave now if that's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you for taking part.
Thank you.
And Carl as well.
have a little discussion now about what happens next. So we've reached the end of the schedule of hearing sessions. So I'm going to obviously be considering all of the evidence in relation to soundness and legal compliance in the light of everything that I have heard over the last, well, not the last 3 weeks, but the total 3 weeks of hearing sessions. And I'll...
Yes, Inspector, could I just check whether or not we're being live streamed?
I think we should be. Yes.
We are. Okay,
Yes.
good.
Yeah, we should be, so that people can observe this if they want to. Yeah, so I will be writing to the council as soon as possible with my post-hearing advice letter. And that is something that once you receive it, you should publish on the website as soon as is practicable. Meanwhile, the council's got various action points to look into and various MMs that we've discussed as we've gone through that you can make a start with drafting. And I'll talk about some of the detail of how to go about that in a minute. Obviously, they're all potential MMs and they'll stay as such at this point in time. But at the moment, they fall into a couple of camps. Some of them are MMs I've already made clear that I think are going to be necessary, albeit the detailed wording of those is still to be drawn up. And then there are some MMs that relate to issues that I will reflect on, as I've said, after the hearings and set out in my advice letter, whether any potential further MMs should be drafted as well. And it remains the case that they're all potential MMs, including those that I've already indicated as necessary, or that I'll refer to in my letter, because they'll all need to be, as you know, subject to public consultation. And I'll take account of any responses that are received from that process. And there is, of course, the possibility that we might need some further hearing sessions, although that's often not necessary, and it does tend to be the exception rather than the norm. But as I say, they remain potential modifications right up until I set up my final conclusions in my report. They'll need to be a bit of to and fro between us via the programme officer to get the drafts drawn up and then checked and agreed by me as being ready for public consultation. And that process does take a bit of time, as there's usually several iterations of the schedule on the way to getting to the final set of MMs that are agreed for consultation.
On the format of the schedule, do you have a particular format that you like? And if so, will you send us an example or direct us to an example?
Yeah, I can do. I'll come on to that in a moment, actually, in a little bit more detail. But yeah, I can happily send you a suggested format. The council, obviously, you're going to need to consider whether MMs give rise to the need for further SA and HRA work. And that work will need to be carried out as necessary before the consultation can start. It would be helpful if you could start to think about the time you're realistically likely to need to prepare all the draft MMs in light of your resourcing and other commitments, etc. And then, of course, there'll need to be time added on to that before we can work out when the consultation starts to get the SA and HRA work of the agreed MMs done. Now, I appreciate you can't say until after you've received my letter, but I mentioned that now about thinking about the general potential time frame. And what I'll probably do is ask you in my letter for an anticipated timetable in response to my letter. It's best when we're thinking about further SA, HRA work, it's best not to initiate any of that work until the full wording is agreed, because otherwise it can lead to duplication of the work. If you SA sort of part draft of the MMs and then something changes, can end up being wasted work and time and expense. So as tempting as it might be to crack on with that, it's best to resist until the MMs are agreed. Does the council know offhand what your procedure is for authorisation for going out to public consultation on the mods? Are you going to need full council agreement, committee agreement, or
Cabinet agreement.
sorry, say that again?
It's been agreed with approval from cabinet.
Cabinet, right? So you'll need to obviously know what the cycle is for that. Obviously, don't commit yourself to any particular cabinet dates at this point in time. But again, it's useful to know what process you've got to go through and what potential dates there might be, because that can have a bearing on the overall timetable for preparation for the consultation as well. Nothing at all relating to the draft modifications should be published until I've agreed it, and that will include, don't put schedules of early draft mods into a report to cabinet, for example, because it leads to all sorts of complications if a version that isn't the final version gets published, and then people get confused between what they think they saw was going to change, and that's not actually the version that goes out to consultation. So don't publish anything unless I've agreed to do that. Similarly, we'll need to agree the consultation start date, and you'll need to think about the length of the consultation period with regard to your SCI requirements. And again, don't worry if you can't get all this down now, you don't have all the answers now, because all the necessary details can be discussed and confirmed between us via email through the programme officer as we go along. In terms of formatting mods in a schedule, all the MMs that relate to a particular policy, or sometimes a section of the plan, if that's a logical way of grouping them together, can be set out in one mod. So say you're doing mods to policy SDS1, set that out in one section of the schedule with one mod reference. And I like a nice straightforward referencing system. MM1, MM2, MM3 is the easiest way to do it. And try and keep the schedule in plan order if at all possible, please. Use the conventional strike through for text that's going to be deleted, bold underlined for text that's going to be added. But if you can avoid using track changes or coloured text or anything like that, because it doesn't tend to transfer well when the schedule is reproduced. Often councils like to produce a separate track changes document of the full plan so people can see the MMs in context, and that track changes plan sits alongside the MM schedule during the consultation. Is that something that you had envisaged potentially doing or not thought about yet?
We could do. Where I've worked before and I've worked on mods, we have done. It's not obviously official, but it is helpful as an illustration.
Yeah, people then know, they can read how the policy might look, sort of thing. Yeah. So it can be helpful. It's not essential, and it's up to you. But obviously, ultimately, at some point, you've got to update the whole plan. So, whether you do it as you go along. My only word of caution, if you are going to do that, is just to be really careful that the track changes in the plan exactly match what the MM's schedule says. We see a lot of versions that don't.
One person in control of one copy.
Yeah, I think so. Because what sometimes happens is with the to and fro of agreeing the changes to the MMs, or even, your team in-house, if you're chatting about a change and you think, oh no, actually, we'll make it say that, and then it gets forgotten to update the plan document as well, or vice versa. So just be alert to that. The draft versions of the MMs schedule, I'll need to have those provided to me in Word, please, not PDFs, so that I can easily edit and provide comments on the draft. And it's helpful in the schedule to add a column on the right just to really briefly explain the reason for each MM, because then representatives understand at the consultation why it's in the schedule, but keep them really, really short. You know, you're not providing a justification in that column, simply a really quick reason for each mod. So it might just say something like update figures from Edna, or consistency with NPPF 150, or something like that, really short and simple.
Okay, or to make the plan effective.
Yeah, if there's no other way of summing it
There's
up,
no other way
yeah,
to,
really, really simple. Just a few words for each mod probably will be enough. All the reasoning as to why the mods are there will be in my report. They don't need to be in the schedule. It's just to highlight to people so that they understand for if they want to make a comment. You'll also need to draw up those various changes to the policies map that we've discussed. And those would need to be published for consultation alongside the MMs. And you'll want to do that as a sort of as proposed to be modified version of the submission policies map. And have that together with a list of what changes you've made to the map. But that list needs to, as I've said all the way through, just needs to be identified separately from the MM's schedule. And then, of course, there's the additional modifications, which again need to be in their own schedule. And the council can consult on those at the same time as the MMs. That's the logical thing to do, just so long as it's clear in the consultation documents that the additional mods are not before me to consider.
yes. Can I ask a question about the policies map?
Yeah.
As you know, we have got an interactive map.
Mm.
Do you want us to start work on a non-public interactive map that both you and the council can have access to during the dialogue period?
Is that reasonably possible? Because that sounds like a good solution, but it depends on your.
I'm looking at Mr. Sherm, who is the
Yeah, it can be done, yes.
Yeah, I mean, so a background copy essentially that's not on the internet until.
Yeah, because the PDF is suboptimal. Now, I don't know
Indeed.
at the end of the day whether or not we have to have a paper copy as the definitive version of the policies map, or whether these days one is allowed to say, well, the interactive version is the definitive version.
I don't know off the top of my head whether it specifies. I think it just says that you have to have one that's based on the OS map, etc., etc. I don't know that it specifies, but
yeah.
But it's a good point, because actually, you know, what people can currently access online is the submission version, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you'll just want to go live with the consultation with the as proposed to be modified version on whatever date that is that the consultation goes live. It switch to that version for people to see.
When you try and zoom in at a very small scale on a PDF version, the pixels just blur everything.
Yeah, it's really difficult, isn't it? And there's so many layers, and it's almost impossible to interrogate at all, isn't it, PDF? So if that can be done as the way, then that would be really helpful, I think.
Good. Well, we will try and do that. If we can't do it, we'll let you know.
Yeah, that would be good.
And we'll send you and we'll send you a link to the background web page that we'll create.
Yes.
Not make it.
So yeah, I mean, obviously, again, just to be completely clear, I'll need to agree all the final versions of everything, the MM schedule, before it's published for consultation, and I'll need to see and clear all the other associated documents, such as things like the further essay work, before the consultation starts and everything's published. Has the council got a particular system that you use for consultation and gathering the responses?
Yeah, we've got a online consultation database that we can use for the consultation.
Okay, and I was just thinking about the content of what the consultation form might say this time, because the wording will probably need to be a bit different from whatever it was you said to people at Regulation 19. So, I mean, perhaps you could let me just see a draft of, you know, what the form says in terms of what questions or boxes or whatever are on there for people to fill. It only needs to be pretty basic and straightforward, actually, for the main mods consultation, because it just needs to be clear that people can only comment on the mods themselves and not the wider plan. But it needs to, you just need to take out things that you might have asked before, like whether or not respondents want to appear at the hearing, because we've had the hearing, and albeit there might be further hearing sessions, that's certainly not guaranteed to be necessary, and we don't want to set false expectations to people that they will get an opportunity to come along and participate in some future hearing that isn't going to happen.
So they shouldn't be given the option to express a view as to whether there should be a hearing.
Well, they can say that as part of their rep, but I don't think we need to give them a particular tick box. We don't need to. Normally there's a question about, you know, would you want to participate in a hearing? If you had that at Reg 19, then that sort of question won't be relevant for this consultation. It can come out.
Have to be sorted.
Yeah, excellent. Any other questions on any of that, or at this point in time? And obviously we'll correspond through Louise, and I'll endeavour to remind you of key points at the appropriate point in time. You can ask questions when you need advice, but any particular questions at this time?
Do you anticipate that there might be a need, when we're trying to agree the final wording of main mods, to have a session like this to be able to do it, or is it all best done by email backwards and forwards?
Typically it's just done by email backwards and forwards, but in theory we could convene with the programme officer if there was something that was particularly thorny, or we were going to spend, you know, weeks backwards and forwards, but 20-minute conversation would resolve it. Then I would certainly consider that.
Yes, and I'm inevitably being asked that if everything goes smoothly, we've got now a planned adoption time in the year 2026-27. And people will start to think about, well, when in that window it might all happen. But I assume that you'd want to be cautious and coy about giving any view about when the final report might arrive and so on and so forth.
Well, I have to be at this point in time, because there is, you know, X amount of time necessary for you to do your extra work. I mean, you're drafting up the strategic policies, etc. So there's quite a bit to do, and to some extent I needed to be guided by you, but also I will have other pieces of work. This isn't the only thing I'm working on, which is why it's helpful if I can get a good idea of a realistic timetable from you, about how long you're going to need to get first drafts done and to get other work done when we come to it, like essay work, for example. Then I can pencil in my diary slots where I will work on this again, so that hopefully it'll dovetail relatively well and there won't be delays while you're waiting for me, but because I'm doing something else on another plan, for example. That's the theory. So if we can communicate over how long it's going to take, and you're going to be, you know, if you can be as realistic as possible with your time frame, because it can be tempting to be over optimistic and then realise, oh, actually we're not going to make that deadline because things take longer than we thought to do. But so yes, there's too much water needs to go under the bridge before I can think about when my report might be ready at this point in time.
I was just I was just getting your help to answer a question that I'd been sent on a post-it note, which otherwise I would have had to have answered afterwards.
Yeah. Would you have given a different answer, Mr. Richardson?
No, I would not. I would give you
No.
the answer that you've given.
Okay. Anything else while we're
No.
still sat here? Okay, well, if there's nothing else, then finally it's just my thanks to all of the council's team and everybody else that has participated through the hearings for engaging in such a sort of constructive, positive, good-humoured manner, and dealt with every question and request that I've thrown at you throughout the hearings. So my thanks for that. And also I'd just like to record my thanks to the programme officer, Louise St John Howe,
Yes.
who's arranged the hearings and the lead up to them in such a calm and organised fashion, made sure everything has run smoothly for us. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Inspector, and a particular thanks to you in the way that you've been making constructive suggestions through this examination process to help the council get its plan into a sound condition. And also thanks to Louise, and we will continue to communicate with the Inspector through you, Louise, over the coming weeks and months.
Excellent. Right. With nothing else left to be said for the time being, then I'll be in touch as soon as possible with my letter. That will need to go through internal processes once I've had the chance to write it. So even that, I can't give you a date for when to expect it at this point in time, but it will be on its way. So thank you very much. And with that, I will close the hearing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.